Hello, my name's Katie Lewis and I'm the Head of MFL at Pearson EdXL. In this short video, I'm going to talk you through some of the key changes for the GCSE specifications for 2024 for French, German and Spanish, and we're going to have a look at each of the 4 papers in turn, as well as the new requirements around the vocabulary and the grammar. So why don't we make a start by thinking about what's new with the GCSE specifications for 2024? And we can ask ourselves that question in terms of what's new for GCSE French, German and Spanish in general, and also what is new and specific for the Pearson EdXL GCSE. So let's say, for example, you were explaining what the changes to GCSE French, German and Spanish were going to look like to a colleague who is less well informed than you about what the new GCSEs are going to be like. What would be some of the key features of the GCSE more broadly that you would highlight for that colleague? What might be some of the key features of the Pearson EdXL specification that you might point out as to be the reason why you decided that our specification was the one that was the best fit for you and for your learners? So what kind of things might those be? Well, let's have a look together. So you might have immediately thought about the reduction in the volume of vocabulary, and we're going to come on to that again in just a second. The increased focus on SSCs, sound symbol correspondences, in the new GCSEs. The reduction of the inference profile, so there will only be inference questions in the reading, no longer in the listening, and they will be single word inference in a multiple choice format. You might have noted the slower listening speed, so a moderate pace as opposed to the near natural pace for the current specification. You might have focused on the fact that for Pearson EdXL, they'll get 3 listens for the listening transcript in the listening paper, which is one of the things which are unique to our specification. You might have reflected on the change from themes, which are the kind of underlying building blocks of the current specification, into thematic contexts, which are our ways of corralling that vocabulary into kind of meaningful and cohesive content. A couple of the other things that you might have noted if you were telling a colleague about the new qualifications. In the Pearson EdXL one, we've tried to put more choice in the hands of the student in a managed way that isn't overwhelming, but allows them to feel a little bit of control of their own destiny. So the exam is something that's happening with them as opposed to something that's happening to them. So they get a choice of colour picture in the picture task for the speaking. They get a choice of writing in all of the open response writing tasks, for example. The fact that we've got the same question type in the same place for the same number of marks every year. So if, for example, you look in the sample assessment materials and you see question 1 in the listening, for example, is a 1-mark multiple choice question with 1 correct answer and 2 distractors, it will always be like that. So that gives a kind of uniformity and reliability to the structure, so students don't get an unpleasant surprise in the exam with a question type they weren't expecting. There's the fact that we've got advanced preparation time, so that students can use that to feel as prepared and confident as possible going into the speaking exam. And then in some of the kind of broader senses of how the qualification has been developed. So to be more student focused in some of those ways I've already mentioned, in fact, to be more accessible, so that the only barrier between the student and the grade that they deserve in MFL is their language knowledge and their ability to manipulate and use the language that they've got, not some other extraneous general knowledge or cultural awareness, that kind of thing. And then finally, for the assessments to be more compassionate, so it's not about jumping through hoops per se, not about having tricksy questions. So those are the main features which we've highlighted are new with our GCSE. I wonder how closely those reflect the ones that you came up with yourself. And we're now going to go and have a look at each of the papers separately. The qualification at a glance here shows us the overview of the structure of the new GCSE. So we've got 4 papers, with paper 1 being the speaking paper, which is a bit of a change there, only to reflect the chronology of the assessment in that the speaking comes first. You'll note that there are 50 marks per paper and that each of the papers is worth 25% of the qualification overall. What that means is there's no scaling on any of the papers, which makes it easier from a tracking of progression perspective. A few things to draw to your attention then. You'll note the preparation time, 15 minutes of preparation time for the speaking, which is more than they have currently because there are more assessments to prepare for, the read aloud, the role play, and the picture task with conversation. The second paper is the listening paper. You might note there that you've got a more generous assessment time for the foundation tier and the higher tier, and that's so that the students can be afforded 3 listens to the listening track. That assessment time for the listening also includes 5 minutes of reading time and 2 minutes of checking time at the end after they've completed the dictation. The reading will probably look very familiar to what you're used to now, in that you've got your reading comprehension followed by your translation into English. And then for the writing, we've retained the additional 5 minutes of assessment time for the foundation tier that we added as a post-COVID adaptation, because that's very useful for the students in A, responding to the writing tasks, and B, helping them where they've got that option of a task for every open response on the writing. It just gives them that little bit of extra time to make the decision about which writing task they want to undertake. We're going to go into the papers in a little bit more detail now. So I mentioned the thematic context as a way of corralling the vocabulary into kind of meaningful categories as opposed to just being a long list of words in like alphabetical order or something. So you can see there in the kind of darker purple what those 6 thematic contexts are. What we've then done further on the right hand side in the light purple is we have made some kind of suggestions of subjects which the vocabulary in the specification lends itself to, and allocated those to one of the thematic contexts. So the first thing that you might want to have a look at is, within those subjects, what, if anything, stands out to you as something that maybe you don't currently teach? And of course, conversely, which topics stand out to you as things that you think, actually, in my current Key Stage 3 or Key Stage 4, those broadly align with the subjects or topic areas that we teach currently? So some of the ones that you might have pulled out as being maybe not part of your current schemes of work could be relationships and equality, possibly social media and gaming. But maybe mental well-being, that might be one that isn't necessarily part of your existing delivery. But broadly speaking, I think in the main, people find that all of the other ones kind of match with what you're doing currently. Now, that doesn't, of course, mean the vocabulary will be exactly the same, because we know there's significantly less vocabulary in the new GCSE. But what it hopefully does mean is it's somewhat reassuring to know that what you're covering in your existing Key Stage 3, for example, is still really excellent and appropriate preparation for the new GCSE. The other thing that's probably worth noting here is just because we have assigned a subject to a thematic context doesn't mean that's the only place it could have been assigned, or indeed the only place that you might like to cover the vocabulary for that subject area. So, for example, we've put transport in travel and tourism. You could equally see, I'm sure, that transport could sit well in my neighbourhood because it might be about how you travel around the place where you live. Another example, we've put food and drink in lifestyle and well-being, but no reason whatsoever why you couldn't imagine that food and drink could be a topic area that would sit really nicely in travel and tourism. So it's a question of, when you're thinking about your planning and your delivery, where are you going to introduce that vocabulary for the first time? Where are you going to reuse and recycle that vocabulary? Because with the significantly fewer vocabulary items that we've got on the new specification, each individual item is going to have to work really hard to make itself as flexible as possible. Okay, so let's have a closer look here at the speaking paper. So we noted already the 15 minutes of preparation time, the read aloud task being the first task that the students do, which is worth 12 marks, then into the role play, and then into the picture task and conversation, which carries 28 marks, which is, of course, as you can see, the most significant number of marks for the speaking exam overall. Probably you're already aware that for that 15 minutes of preparation time, the first 14 minutes of the 15 will take place in the invigilation space, and then the final 1 minute of the 15 will take place in the examination room immediately prior to the assessment starting. And that is so that the students can have the chance to practice the read aloud passage out loud if they want to, before they have to read it out loud for real, as it were. The reason for doing that is that often the shared preparation space is shared, so you can't have lots of students all reading out loud at the same time. They have to prepare in silence. But when we asked students, if you had to do a read aloud task in your GCSE, would you rather practice it out loud first if you could, or only practice it in your head? And something like 88% of them said, I'd rather the chance to read it out loud first. So we've kind of managed this preparation time in order to afford the students that chance if they want to. For those 12% who would rather not, they can just use that 1 minute preparation time any way they see fit because it's part of that overall 15 minutes anyway. So a few other things to point out. You'll notice the total assessment time is obviously slightly higher for the higher tier than the foundation tier, and you'll notice as well the recommended task durations for each of the 3 different tasks in the speaking. Those are recommended as opposed to compulsory, so there isn't a sort of penalty or anything like that for being outside of those ranges. And especially for the read aloud and the role play, realistically, there's nothing for you to do in terms of padding out or somehow managing to stretch out those tasks in order to make them meet that minimum time. You just go through the task as it is presented on the teacher examiner cards. For the conversation, if the students are of the type where they might go significantly over the top end, there's no need for them to do that. The examiners are likely to kind of bring their marking to a conclusion with the final utterance that kind of takes the student up to that maximum time. So there isn't really any point in them talking for 7-8 minutes or whatever if we haven't heard enough to give them the mark that they deserve within the first 5.5 minutes. That additional 2, 3, 4 minutes at the end isn't going to make any difference particularly. So be mindful of the timings, make sure you leave enough time so that you can get those maximum number of marks from that final 28 mark task, but don't worry about slowing down or padding out those recommended times in order to meet them if the task has been successfully accomplished to a slightly different time range. So let's just do a quick recap then of the key speaking points. So some of the things which stand out as unique to the Pearson Edexcel specification: the 1 minute of time to practice the read aloud out loud. They can also annotate directly onto the read aloud card, so they can transcribe it, highlight however they want to, circle words, underline and so on to help them with that delivery. For the role play, the 10 realistic transactional settings which are printed in the specification, the role plays in the assessments will always be taken from one of those 10 settings. Of course, the student doesn't know which one it's going to be, but they know it's going to be one of the ones that they have had the opportunity to experience, understand, prepare in advance in the classroom. So even if they perhaps haven't been to a restaurant or a campsite, let's say, you've brought that experience of restaurants and campsites and the kind of interactions that one has there into the classroom for them. So we're all on an equal footing. The reliability of the prompts and where the questions that the student asks are going to have to be for the role play. The fact that the student gets to 2 weeks in advance of the opening of the speaking window, select which of the 6 thematic contexts they would like for their picture task and conversation. So that means that they can spend the time then looking for pictures and describing them, understanding What kind of things might come up in a conversation about my selected thematic context? What kind of things would I want to draw upon from my past experience in the context of that thematic context? What kind of images and people and clothing and settings might be appropriate to my thematic context, so I can feel as well prepared as possible? The fact that they will choose one picture from a choice of two, both in colour, in the preparation time, so that they can pick the one where they feel they've got the best chance of showing off the language that they've got, and the fact that of those 16 marks that I highlighted are for the conversation part of the picture, task and conversation in the speaking exam. 12 of the 16 are for communication only. So 4 of them are for the grammar and the technical accuracy. But even if a student is feeling shy or nervous or worried that they might be going to make a grammatical error, and that kind of puts them off saying anything, kind of makes them feel worried, I better not speak in case I make a mistake. Let's try and throw that kind of self-restricting mentality away and say, actually, as far as is close to normal as possible, when we have a conversation, it's about me listening to you, you listening to me, and us kind of sharing, exchanging our points of view, etc. So really trying to emphasize that the conversation is about communicating. And obviously for those students who can do so in a really accurate way, they do have the opportunity to pick up additional marks for technical accuracy as well. So let's have a look at the listening paper. We've mentioned already it's out of 50, so 40 marks for the comprehension and 10 marks for the new task of the dictation. One of the things which is new for GCSE is that all of the questions, the rubrics and the students' responses, when they are required to write something down, will all be in English. We know that we hear the transcript 3 times, but what you might not know is that actually the total number of words that the students listen to is prescribed in the regulations. So you'll see there 450 to 550 words for the foundation tier and 700 to 850 for the higher tier. So whether they listen to it twice, like with another awarding organisation, or whether they listen to it 3 times, like with Pearson, they are actually listening to the same number of words. They're just getting an extra chance to understand it with our listening paper. The dictation, 20 words for the foundation tier, 30 words for the higher tier, and that's split between 3 gap fill and 3 full sentences for the foundation tier, and 2 gap fill and 4 full sentences for the higher tier. Another noteworthy point about the dictation is it's required for the new GCSE that there are words taken from outside the vocabulary list in the dictation. There will be 2 of those in the foundation tier and there will be 3 of those in the higher tier, and they will always sit in the gap fill part of the assessment. And then finally, we will accept as part of our marking of the dictation where a student misspells, but that spelling is actually an accurate rendering of the sound symbol correspondence, we would accept that. So there's a bit of a safety net there for students, particularly in those languages. I'm thinking of French, where there are multiple different ways of rendering the same sound, all of which are viable. It just depends on which word it is that you're trying to render, but so long as they get that sound rendered appropriately for the target language, we would accept it. So I think much which is going to look familiar to you here on the reading paper. So we've already said 50 marks for the reading overall, 40 of those marks are for the reading comprehension and 10 marks for the translation. Like we said for the listening, the questions, the rubrics and the student responses where they have to write a response or make a selection from multiple choice, for example, all of that is going to be in English. The other amendment to how the reading is going to be structured is that they will be inferring only in the reading paper and only on a single word inference. So they're no longer conceptually inferring, if you like, they're just inferring the meaning of a word they don't know based on their knowledge of the surrounding words which they do know. So here you can see some of the key features of the listening and reading, most of which I think I probably already pointed out. I'll just draw out the use of images in the reading paper. So where there is a culturally specific setting of the tasks in the reading paper, we'll include a colour image so that a student who might not be familiar with that cultural setting has the same equal starting point of knowledge as a student who may, for whatever reason, be familiar with that place. An example, in the sample assessment materials, there is a text about Paris Plage, and in the reading paper, there is a picture of Paris Plage, so that students are not thinking, I didn't know Paris was on the coast, or maybe they're thinking, oh yeah, I knew Paris was on the coast, or they're thinking, what is it? I didn't know there was a river that went through Paris. We don't know what their levels of kind of cultural awareness are going to be. So the image helps them to all have that same equal footing. I mentioned most of the aspects there which are true of both, with the exception of the ramping. So our model for ramping in our question papers is the easiest questions come towards the beginning, and then they get progressively more demanding as the paper continues. We don't do a kind of up and down profile of demand. The reason being that a student who is maybe operating at the lower end of the ability profile doesn't get hit with a question which is outside potentially of their scope early doors and have their confidence knocked and then have to pick themselves back up again for the next question, which has dropped back down again. They should be able to move through with each one becoming progressively more difficult, and of course try and keep going as far as they can, but not have that knock of confidence if they come up against something a bit too demanding for them, which can kind of put them off getting any further in the paper. So let's move on and look at the writing. So we have designed the tasks in the writing exam to be within the student's own likely experiences. So for example, here you can see something about schools and something about shopping. We are giving the students a choice of writing tasks, and the only difference between the choices that they get, 1A or 1B, 2A or 2B, will be the subject. So write to your friends about shopping, write to your friends about school. So it's just which of those two topic areas do I feel I've got the most to say about. We give the questions in English, and we provide scaffolding bullet points which reflect the amount that the students are expected to write. So on the shorter task, on the foundation tier, we give them 3 bullet points, and then on the longer tasks, on the foundation tier and the higher tier, they've got 4 bullet points. So they get more support and scaffolding about how to reach those 80 to 90, 120 to 150 word counts. We also, in the bullet points, give them a clear expectation of timeframes, what you have done recently, what you will do next, so that they can cover the tenses required to make sure that they access as much of the mark scheme as is possible. There isn't any requirement for students to use the formal register in either the writing or in fact in the speaking either. So even if it's a context which is arguably a formal context, they do not have to use the formal register. They don't have to follow the order of the bullet points. They do have to cover all 4 of the bullet points or all 3 of the bullet points, but they don't have to cover them in the order that we have prescribed. So the writing paper then all together, you can see there the crossover question, question 3, the final open response question of the foundation tier corresponds with question 1, the first question of the higher tier, and the foundation tier has 1 extra task because they open with that describe question related to a colour picture, where all they have to do is write 4 descriptive statements, sentences about that picture. So I mentioned already the reduction in the number of vocab items on the new specification. You're probably covering around 2,500 items on the vocabulary list as they stand at the moment for GCSE. So the 1,200 common words, which are the totality of the foundation tier words and the core of the higher tier words, is a significant reduction, as you can see. Then for the higher tier, on top of that 1200 common vocabulary, they have 500 additional items that takes them up to 1700 words in total. One of the other significant changes is, where do those vocabulary items come from? Well, 85% of them come from the top 2,000 most frequently occurring words in the target language. The idea, therefore, being that if students are extremely secure with the words that are used most frequently, they'll be able to use that secure knowledge in a wide range of different contexts and situations. 15% of the words can come from anywhere, and so we use those words to create vocabulary which is interesting, engaging, appropriate to 15, 16-year-old students studying a foreign language in a foreign country. Because obviously the most frequent words in a target language are taken from a frequency dictionary, from a corpus, and sources for that corpus might not always be the ones that one would have picked as being, oh, what an interesting document for a 15-year-old in England to engage with. So you've got that flexibility in that 15% to add a bit of tailoring to our students' interests. In addition, you've got 20 geographical or cultural items, so that would be words like France, Paris, Tour Eiffel, that kind of thing. And you've got 30 multi-word phrases, so that would be, for example, things like il y a, when knowing the constituent parts of the multi-word phrase wouldn't allow you to understand that meaning when the words were combined. Another change from now is not just are there fewer words, but only words from the list will appear in our assessments. So if you have learned, rather if you have taught your students and they have learned all of the 1200 words which are common, plus the 500 words extra for those children on the higher tier, if they have been taught those and the grammar, they have all of the tools that they need to access the assessments. There are two small exceptions. They are, you might know this already from what I've already covered, they are the inference question in the reading, because obviously they have to infer the meaning of a word that they don't know. And where's the other ones? Anyone remember? In the dictation. So it's a requirement of the subject criteria that they render in writing a word that they haven't previously kind of memorized how it's written. So with those two notable exceptions, only words from the list will appear in our assessments. Now, what does that mean for the productive tasks? Obviously, we set our productive tasks in the context of students being able to respond fully with vocabulary that's on the list. So, for example, we're not going to come up with a topic for the writing which is about something that there aren't sufficient vocabulary items on the list for the students to use. If the students choose, because they've been introduced to a wider range of vocabulary, which almost inevitably I expect you're going to do in your classroom practice, if they choose to draw upon vocabulary that comes from outside of the list in their productive tasks, they are absolutely welcome to do that, and they will get equal credit. They won't get extra credit, they'll get equal credit. So that is the way in which they can draw upon that wider range of vocabulary should they choose. But a student who sticks religiously to those 1200 or 1700 words, plus manipulates the grammar appropriately and effectively, is fully able to access the full range of the mark schemes and the full range of grades. So finally, in case you have not yet seen it, I want to draw your attention to the grammar guidance, which you can find in Appendix 2 of the specifications. So you have there the section on sound symbol correspondences, which will tell you each one of those correspondences that your students need to be familiar with for the target language in question. You'll also find the common grammar requirements that cover both the foundation tier and the higher tier, as well as the grammar requirements which are higher tier only. We hope in presenting it like that, it makes it a little bit more user-friendly and clear what's required for both tiers and what's required for higher tier only. Thank you for watching this introductory video to our Getting Ready to Teach walkthroughs. Please look out for the subsequent videos, which will cover the read aloud, the dictation, some more information on the speaking and the vocabulary requirements, as well as information about the published resources which are going to support the new qualification. And thank you very much for your time and attention.